was the early hours of the 8th of August 1963, in a quiet place where no one would expect the crime of the century. In the cover of darkness, a daring gang made off with £2.6 million. And of course, talking about the story of the Great Train Robbery.
From an early age, I've been infatuated with trains and railways in general. As a kid, I loved a bit of Thomas the Tank Engine and always aspired to be the Fat Controller. I'm not a controller yet, so we're halfway there. For me, there's nothing quite like the sight, the sound and the smell of an engine. Trains are massive vehicles that embody the power of the Industrial Revolution. They captivate my imagination in a way nothing else does, in ways I can't even describe with words. That's why this case is especially interesting to me, because this formidable system of transport and travel was so easily exploited through planning and luck. When you think about heists of colossal proportions, the first thing you imagine might be a bank, maybe a museum filled to the brim with priceless art, or a train in some forgotten nowhere slap bang in the middle of Wild West. Perhaps you picture a meticulous plan where every possibility is accounted for. A perfect scheme where every minute detail is anticipated, every step of the way, all the way to the exact amount of money in the pot come the end. The perfect criminal, the perfect crime, the perfect escape. Well, this heist was almost perfect. This story begins way prior. To understand the context of the crime, we must first understand the story of the mastermind behind it. That story begins with a man named Bruce Richard Reynolds. Born on the 7th of September of 1931 in London, England, Reynolds' mother died when he was 4 years old, and his father was a trade union activist at the Ford assembly plant in Dagenham. A relatively ordinary working class background. Bruce Reynolds found his father to be a difficult man, often opting to spend his time around his grandparents up until the Second World War, where he'd be evacuated from the capital. Reynolds would leave school aged 14 years with aspirations to join the Royal Navy. Due to his poor eyesight, which meant he relied on glasses, he would not make it very far in the selection process. Instead, Reynolds applied for a job working at Northcliffe House, the head office for the Daily Mail and General Trust, where he worked as a messenger boy before working in the accounts department for the Daily Mail. Reynolds would eventually find his working routine to be dull and will find a new job at the Sutton Institute of Pathology at Middlesex Hospital, and then he'd join a bicycle builder and seller, Claude Butler, as a messenger and later a member of their racing team. It is believed this is where he will come into contact with criminals and embark on a life of petty crime. Reynolds found himself serving time at HMP Wormwood Scrubs and then Borstal Prison, now known as HMP Rochester, for the crimes of theft. Bruce Reynolds would escape from Borstal, although he would eventually be caught and sent back to prison, this time serving time at Reading Prison. After this time, he spent more time doing national service in the British Army. Although he deserted after a matter of weeks into his mandatory 2-year term and resuming his criminal activity, in 1952 he would be sentenced to 3 years for breaking and entering, serving time on the juvenile wing of Wandsworth Prison in London. However, this would not correct him. The young Bruce Reynolds will begin to break into large country homes, stealing jewellery from seemingly wealthy victims. In 1957, Reynolds would be arrested once again, alongside a man named Terry Hogan, also known as Lucky Tell, a notorious character in the criminal underworld of London in the 1950s and 60s. Reynolds and Hogan had assaulted a bookmaker and stolen £500. Reynolds would receive 3.5 years imprisonment for this, whereas Hogan would receive 2.5 years, spending time in both HMP Wandsworth and HMP Durham before being released in 1960, where Reynolds would refine his craft of theft and disguise it, becoming an antiques dealer. Bruce Reynolds would join a gang with a man named Harry Booth and his future brother-in-law, John Daly. He would later meet Buster Edwards and Gordon Goody. In 1962, this gang would steal over £60,000 from a security van at Heathrow Airport, and then rob £700 from a Royal Mail train passing through Swindon. A disappointing score, but that would not deter them. Over a period of the few months that followed, Bruce Reynolds would begin to hatch a plan for another train robbery, one that would define his career as a criminal. After receiving a tip-off from an unknown senior security officer within Royal Mail, who had detailed knowledge of the planned journey, known simply as the Ulsterman, the plan was simple. With a gang of 15 men strong, intercept the unguarded overnight Glasgow to London mail train and steal its contents. The core team behind the planning was comprised of Bruce Reynolds, Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards and Charlie Wilson. Despite being an experienced bunch of criminals, they didn't really know how to stop a train in order to carry out this raid. So they enlisted the aid of a gang named the South Coast Riders, comprised of Thomas Wisby, Bob Welch, Roger Cordery, Jim Hussey, who were proven and capable of robbing trains, in particular due to Cordery's specific knowledge in rigging the track and signals in order to confuse the train's operating crew, bringing the engine to a stop. As the plan evolved, other individuals such as Ronnie Briggs would become involved in the scheme. The crew's roles were as followed: Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, the brain behind the operation; Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards and Charlie Wilson, the co-organisers and treasurers; Brian Arthur Field, an informant who organised the mock purchase of Leverslade Farm, a nearby estate that functioned as the gang's hideout during the robbery; Roy John James and John Thomas Daly, the getaway drivers who would also uncouple the carriages; James Edward White, and a man whose identity remains unconfirmed, also aided in carriage uncoupling; Roger John Cordery, an expert train stopper and an expert in electronics. He knew how to manipulate the signal light using crocodile clips and a sock; Robert Welch, Thomas Wisby, James Hussey and Danny Pembroke, also along with a man whose identity remains unknown, functioned as muscle; Ronald Arthur Briggs, a contact who provided the replacement train driver; an unknown replacement train driver; and an unknown individual known as the Ulsterman, the key informant who contacted Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, tipping them off about the money being transported. With all that established, here's how it went down. The train was a Class 40. The diesel-electric locomotive, D326, known today as 4126, set off from Glasgow at 6:50 p.m. on the 7th of August 1963, en route to Euston Station. It pulled 12 carriages, including 72 post office staff sorting mail along the journey. Despite its massive haul of money, the train was completely unguarded, at least not by professionals of any description. As the train ventured south, it would make additional stops at stations to pick up and drop off mail. It would also collect mail at line-side collection points, where sacks full of mail would be elevated on hooks along the track side to be gathered by nets deployed by the train's staff. As it travelled, any sorted mail could be dropped off to where it needed to go simultaneously. The reason for this was to avoid making unnecessary stops. Sitting immediately behind the engine was the carriage dedicated to high-value packages, aptly named the HVP carriage. This type of carriage typically contained vast amounts of money, around a few £100,000, with a fair bit of fluctuation. However, this time it was different. According to the Ulsterman, on this particular night, the HVP carriage would carry around £1 million. It wasn't accurate information, but in a good way for any daring enough to take on the robbery, as on this night its take was well over £2 million. Interestingly, the prospect of robbery was made possible by an oversight of sorts. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch recommended the fitting of alarms to all carriages containing these significant amounts of money. This would be put into action. The following year, for the most part, some reserve HVP carriages will remain without an alert alarm. The standard HVP carriage, to be expected by 1963, would be fitted with both alarms and bars over the windows, along with bolts across the door catches. These carriages were few, and the few that were around were unavailable due to the required servicing. A reserve carriage would step up to replace the main HVP carriages. It had no bars, no door catches, and no alarm. The fitting of radios on board HVPs was also considered. However, they were deemed too costly, which is ironic when you consider how much money these trains were carrying. The reserve carriage in question was M30204M. Come around 3 AM of the 8th of August, the train was travelling along the West Coast Main Line where it approached a red signal light at Sears Crossing, Ledburn. Sitting between Leighton Buzzard, Bedfordshire and Cheddington, Buckinghamshire, 58-year-old driver Jack Mills stopped the train to comply with the signal light. Another member of the locomotive's crew, David Whitby, would climb down from the cab to call the signalman from a line-side telephone, where he discovered the cables had been cut. As he returned to the engine, he would be blitzed, attacked and overpowered by the robbers as they made their move. Members of the crew would enter the cab of the Class 40 from either side. Jack Mills would attempt to resist the hijacking attempt before receiving a blow to the head that left him concussed and only semi-conscious. Other members of the gang simultaneously uncoupled the rest of the carriages from the engine, and the HVP carriage. The experienced train driver on the crew would then be required to move the train 800 metres down the line to where the gang would unload the carriage. However, due to the new type of locomotive being used, the hired train driver was unable to operate it. Jack Mills was then forced to move the train to their planned stopping point at a bridge called Bridgeo Bridge, now officially known as Mentmore Bridge, although it is known as the Train Robbers Bridge, albeit informally. With the train now in place, the muscle of the gang would storm the HVP carriage, with others forming a human chain to pass the loot from the train down from the embankment to where the trucks would be waiting to be loaded up. The 4 postal workers aboard the carriage would be forced to lie face down on the floor in one corner whilst the gang carried this out. The engine crew would be brought to this carriage, handcuffed together and placed beside the other staff. Of the 128 sacks aboard the carriage, the crew managed to take 120 in the space of around 15 to 20 minutes. The combined weight of these bags was estimated to be around 2.5 tons. Finally, 30 minutes after the robbery had been initiated, the gang left aboard 3 vehicles, 1 Austin Landstar and 2 Land Rovers bearing identical registration plates as a means to confuse possible eyewitness accounts. The registration read BMG 757A. The alarm wouldn't be raised until around 4:20 AM, where the gang would hear over a VHF radio, "A robbery has been committed and you'll never believe it, they've stolen a train." By 4:30 AM, the gang arrived back at Leverslade Farm, a rundown property roughly 27 miles from where the robbery took place, which had been purchased months prior to function as a hideout. It's here where the score was counted and the end number sat above 2.6 million, the majority of which was in £1 and £5 notes. This number is however disputed. Regardless, the money the robbers had stolen was simply far more than they expected. The proceeds were then divided into 16 full shares and several smaller shares for associates involved in the robbery who weren't actually present. The full shares would amount to around £150,000 each, which would equate to the spending power of 2.5 million today. That's a lot of money to go missing, and no doubt the police would soon be on their tails. Using a radio tuned into police channels, the gang knew the police were looking for them within a 30-mile radius. A witness at the crime had told the police that one gang member told postal staff to wait 30 minutes before moving, which led many to believe the gang had gone to ground somewhere within 30 miles of the crime scene. The police used what's known as a dragnet tactic, a method in which a large number of law enforcement could search a specific area to cover the ground quickly. The gang, realising this, knew that the police would discover their hideout at Leverslade Farm sooner than planned. The vehicles used in the robbery would not be able to carry the gang out of the area as they had been seen during the crime, so alternate transport was arranged and the plan to make their escape was accelerated. That's not to say that the farm wasn't sterilised. A comprehensive clean-up was undertaken, prints were wiped off surfaces, and the farm was to be burnt by an associate of the gang known as Mark. However, this Mark would never carry out the burning and the farm stood. By the time the gang discovered that the Mark had decided not to make good on his arrangement, it was too late. The police had found their hideout. On the morning of the robbery at 5 AM, head of Buckinghamshire Police Criminal Investigation Department, operating out of Aylesbury, Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell arrived at the bridge where the heist took place to supervise the gathering of evidence. Hoping for any good clues as to what happened, Futrell then headed over to Cheddington Station where the train was taken after the robbery. Here, statements would be gathered from the postal workers and the injured driver, Jack Mills. It's here where they learned that the postal staff had been instructed not to move for 30 minutes and was deducted that the gang likely had hidden somewhere within 30 miles of the bridge. Besides this, they learnt roughly 15 hooded men dressed in blue boiler suits had stormed the train in a precise robbery and had taken 120 bags stacked full of money. Little else could be discerned at this time. Futrell quickly became aware that extra resources would be required to handle an investigation of this scale effectively. The Buckinghamshire Chief Constable would then refer the case to Scotland Yard. This case was quickly brought to the attention of London's Serious and Organised Crime Command, specifically the branch known as the Flying Squad. George Hathrell and Detective Chief Superintendent Ernest Millen would handle the operation from London. However, Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur and Detective Sergeant John Pitchard were sent to assist police efforts in Buckinghamshire. The major search of the surrounding area began. At the scene of the crime, little to no forensic evidence was found. Seaports would be put on a watch, and the Portmaster General Reginald Bevins would offer a meaty reward of £10,000 to the first person giving information leading to the apprehension and later conviction of individuals behind the scheme. It wouldn't take long for a tip-off to come through a herdsman who utilised the field across from Leverslade Farm, leading police stopping by the scene 5 days after the robbery on the 13th of August 1963. They found the farm to be deserted. However, they also found a truck that was used by the robbers. It had been painted yellow in what appeared to be in a hurry, as well as 2 Land Rovers. They would also find significant amounts of food, bedding and sleeping bags, and most incriminating of all, post office sacks and mail packages, as well as wrappers used for banknotes. They also found a Monopoly board game. This is brilliant. It's believed the robbers used some of the money they had stolen to play Monopoly as they waited for the heat to die down. Whilst it was clear the farm had been cleared for fingerprints, some would remain. They found prints on a ketchup bottle and on a Monopoly set. Despite now having a thread to pull on, the investigation was growing stagnant. Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler would replace Millen as the head of the Flying Squad and quickly formed a 6-man squad to investigate the train robbery. The squad consisted of Detective Inspector Frank Williams, Detective Sergeant Steve Moore, Detective Sergeant Jack Slipper, Detective Sergeant Jim Neville, Detective Sergeant Lou Van Dyke, and Detective Constable Tommy Thorburn, along with Frank Williams, who specialised in handling informants. Tommy Butler was an interesting character. Considered a piercingly cold individual, he was renowned as One Day Tommy due to how quickly he was known to apprehend the criminals he was tasked with catching. He was an unmarried man who still resided with his mother, with dedication to nothing but his job. He would work incredibly long hours and expect his squad to do the same. The squad were only getting 3 hours of sleep per night on average, and barely had the time to eat healthily or even see their families properly. Any attempt to get him to ease on the working conditions would enrage Butler, who would simply threaten to send them back to their normal duties. In the end, they had to work out a rotation to allow one member of the team to go home and rest at a time. Despite the high expectations of the squad, Butler played his cards close to the chest, a secretive man who, according to Jack Slipper, he was the kind of man who wouldn't even tell his left hand what the right one was doing. Often members of the train robbery squad were flying blind, being dispatched to carry out tasks with no understanding of how it fits into the broader picture. Moving on, the post office own investigation would establish how much was actually stolen to the exact amount: £2,595,997 and 10 shillings. There's some dispute over how precise the number really is, with many sources suggesting over 2.6 million being stolen rather than just under it. The investigation's breakthrough came somewhat prior, with Detective Chief Superintendent Millen encountering a respected barrister in the smoking area of a West End club, who had told Millen that someone was willing to inform the gang. The informer's identity was never disclosed to anybody, who wasn't essential to gathering the information. All that's known is this individual had been jailed just prior to the train robbery and was informing in hopes that it would grant him some favours, perhaps an early parole. The informant did not know the names of all the robbers. However, another informant helped aid the police to get on the right track. This process gave authorities 18 names to work with and match up the list of names prepared from fingerprints gathered at the farm. Millen and Heather Rill, who had worked the informant, decided to publish photographs of the now wanted men. Tommy Butler and Frank Williams did not like this, as it meant most of the robbers would go to ground before they could be located. The first man involved in the robbery to be captured was Roger Codry, who had been living in a rented flat above a florist shop in Bournemouth. Bournemouth police had received information from a woman stating that Codry had paid her 3 months' rent for a garage she owned up front in used 10-shilling notes. Roger Codry and his friend William Bowl, who was helping him lie low, were caught despite Bowl not actually being involved with the train robbery, and was sentenced to 24 years behind bars. A few years later, in 1970, he would die in prison and would later be acknowledged by the authorities as a victim of a miscarriage of justice. Further arrests would follow. 8 members of the crew and a handful of associates would be captured. On the morning of the 16th of August 1963, while out walking in Dorking Woods, 2 people discovered a briefcase and a bag containing money. They contacted the police, who discovered another briefcase full of money hidden in the woods, combining the total sum of £100,900 found. Inside one of the bags contained a receipt from a hotel in a town in Germany named out to Herr and Frau Field. The money would be delivered to Futrell and MacArthur in Aylesbury, who knew Brian Field to be a clerk at James and Heater, who had enacted the purchase from Leverslade Farm. Interpol would confirm Brian and Karen Field had been in Germany in the February of that year. This is how the police confirmed Field had acted on behalf of the train robbers. A few weeks after this discovery, the police interviewed him at his home. He provided a cover story that implicated Lenny Field, of no relation, as the farm's purchaser, but admitted visiting the farm, unaware of the receipt found with the money in Dorking Wood. He confirmed he and his wife had been to Germany on holiday and provided details of the place he'd stayed on the 15th of September 1963. Field was arrested, and his boss, John Wheater, would also be arrested 2 days later. In 1964, a trial was held for the captured gang members and conspirators. The defendants were brought to court every day from Aylesbury Prison in a compartmentalised van, away from the line of sight of the large spectating crowd. The trial would last 51 days, feature over 600 exhibits and over 200 witnesses. All but one were found guilty. The shocker, however, would come in sentencing. John Thomas Daly had no case to answer. However, Ronald Arthur Briggs faced a sentence of 30 years behind bars. Douglas Gordon Goody, Charles Frederick Wilson, Thomas William Wisby, Robert Welch, James Hussey, and Roy John James also faced 30 years behind bars. Each received 25 years for conspiracy to rob and 30 years for armed robbery, sentences that will run concurrently. Roger Codry will face 20 years behind bars. Brian Field faced 25 years for his part in the conspiracy. Leonard Field would also face 25 years. William Bowl, a man who was mostly uninvolved and only sheltered someone, received 24 years behind bars, and John Wheater, the boss of Brian Field, received 3 years for aiding and abetting a crime. With the proceedings over, the judge described the robbery as a crime of sordid violence inspired by vast greed. These harsh sentences were met with outrage. The robbery was one thing, but the Great Train Robbery was an assault on the establishment, and in return the establishment had made an example. The bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. Train robbers who found themselves sentenced later and by other judges received far less harsh penalties. Naturally, these harsh sentences were met with appeals. Lenny Field and Brian Field, of no relation, appealed against the charges of conspiracy to rob in July of 1964. The charges were quashed, although Justice Atkinson would state that he wouldn't be surprised if Field was actually there on the track that night. The vast majority of other charges against the other men, however, stuck. You'd think the story would end there, but it only continues. On the 12th of August, Charlie Wilson escaped from Winston Green Prison in Birmingham within the time frame of under 3 minutes. A 3-man team broke into the prison to extract him. The team that carried out this risky infiltration were never caught, and its leader, a fellow named Frenchy, vanished from the London criminal underworld by the latter years of the 1960s. Wilson fled to Paris, where he received cosmetic surgery, and by November of 1965 had made his way to Mexico City to visit Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards, who had ventured there to avoid capture. 15 months into his prison sentence, Ronnie Briggs absconded from Wandsworth Prison in July of 1965. Briggs paid a significant amount of money to be smuggled into Europe. In Paris, Briggs also underwent cosmetic surgery and acquired new identity papers. He then moved to Adelaide, Australia, where he became a construction worker. When Interpol started sniffing around, he slipped away to Melbourne and later Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where due to the lack of extraditionary treaty, he was technically safe. Fathering a Brazilian son, he was afforded legal immunity when he lived openly in Brazil for many years. Safe from the powers chasing him, he would not return to England until 2001. Aged 71, he accepted the possibility of his arrest and was apprehended upon landing. His reason for returning? Well, he just simply wanted a pint. He would be freed 2 days before his 80th birthday on compassionate grounds. Edwards voluntarily returned to England in 1966 and received a prison sentence of 15 years. Bruce Reynolds and his family would quickly leave Mexico and go to Canada before going to France. Living lavishly meant the money soon began to dry up. Bruce Reynolds decided to return to England and settled in Torquay before eventually being captured by Tommy Butler in 1968, who had postponed his retirement in order to see the case out. Bruce Reynolds was the last of the train robbers to be arrested. After Reynolds was caught, he supposedly told Butler that the harsh sentences had sent a detrimental message to the criminal underworld that promoted criminals to take weapons with them when carrying out robberies. Although the sentences were harsh, many of the convicted did not serve the full terms given to them. Many would be out after only serving a decade. It is possible around 6 members of the gang escaped from any form of punishment. The mysterious Ulsterman, who gave the intelligence on the train's journey to the gang. 3 unknown robbers were also never caught. John Daly's charges were dismissed, and the replacement train driver, who was never formally named nor charged. There have been theories as to who the Ulsterman was. Gordon Goody even identified a man named Patrick McKenna, who passed away in 1992. Although his family disputed this, they claimed Patrick McKenna had no privileged access to information regarding money transported on the mail train. Another possibility was a man named Sammy Osterman, a friend of Tommy Wiseby and a fixer to the criminal underworld of London. His surname, bearing similarities to Ulsterman, may have caused a distortion that created the moniker. Neither theory has been confirmed and likely never will be. In the aftermath of the entire affair, Jack Mills, the driver who was hit on the head during the robbery, would suffer constant headaches for the rest of his life. Scarred mentally by the trauma of the robbery, he passed away from leukemia in 1970. David Whitby was left traumatised by his assault on the trackside. He passed away aged 34 from a heart attack in Crewe. As for the scene of the robbery, the high value package carriage M30204M will be burnt in a Norfolk scrapyard 7 years after the robbery to deter souvenir hunters. One of the post office carriages from the remaining train that was uncoupled was preserved at the Nene Valley Railway at Peterborough in Cambridgeshire. The locomotive English Electric Type 4 D326, otherwise known as 4126, will continue service, being involved in several serious operating incidents. It garnered a reputation for being the unluckiest engine to be on in England, with some crew members outright refusing to operate aboard it. The engine would be scrapped in Doncaster Works in the 1980s, with no parts remaining, which is unusual, as souvenirs will be removed from other classmates, but in the case of 4126, no part of the locomotive survived. The Monopoly board used at Leverslave Farm, along with a £5 note from the robbery, can be found displayed at the Thames Valley Police Museum in Berkshire. The location of the robbery was known for some years by Network Rail as Train Robbers Bridge, though many preferred its original name. In 2013 it was renamed Mentmore Bridge. A plaque is visible at this site, marking its significance to the case. Of the roughly 2.6 million stolen, under 400,000 would be recovered. The vast majority was spent by those who evaded immediate capture, and many who were later apprehended were arrested penniless, at least relatively. As for those who were caught, many would spend tens of thousands on legal fees. Wonder where that money came from. The Great Train Robbery has made its mark on history as a truly thrilling example of high-stakes crime. Whilst it's not something we can condone, the undertaking of the robbery and subsequent investigation that followed is a fascinating story that even includes a little bit of trains, so consider Jones happy. The concept of a daring heist has made many gripping stories over the years, books, movies and the like. For something this absurdly bold to occur in real history is almost unbelievable. But as we can see, the crime of the century always has its caveats. The bigger reward, the bigger the risk. Not anticipating how much there was to steal, more accurately, was a costly mistake. I hope you enjoyed today's video. It's certainly been a thrill to make, and it's certainly interesting learning more about this topic from a creator's point of view. If you like this video, share it, subscribe, and make sure you hit the notification bell. If you have a friend that would be interested in watching a Decades video, but don't really have the time to do it, make sure you put them in a HVP van, tie them up, and hope that our content doesn't get stolen from them whilst they're being forced to watch it. That'll be all. Thank you.
Do remember that if you lean over too far, everyone will see your bottom.
It's in second valve now, that's off.
Man drinks Oasis on a regular basis.
Are you filming that? don't have to look at the camera. Just don't pay attention to the camera at all. Just don't pay attention to the camera.
Oh. Oh.
Jones! Hello. I think this is designed to handle both of our weights. Right, on you go.
That's good.
Why did they let us do this?